Those of you who are familiar with the public budget, this is very much a budgeting 101 discussion. So I apologize for that, but as you can see, half of the people in the room, this is brand new. They have not been through this kind of a process before. And to those of you who are new to public budgeting, I want to let you know it's a little different than what you've done in your businesses. It's a little different than the budgets that you've looked at before. So I'm going to go over the highlights. Susan has told me that she'll have me down in April, and I'll tease my presentation today with some of the things that we'll talk about in April that are things that I've pulled out of the slides. I usually prepare about 75 minutes worth of material, and I try to get it done in 30. And so today we're going to move pretty fast. And so I'm going to try to keep it interesting, and I'm going to move at a pretty fast pace. I don't have a lot of time for questions while we're presenting because of that, but I will stick around afterward in case you have some questions that we want to talk about. This is the slide that my son reminded me is the one that I need to tell the audience why they should listen to me. This is representative of just a few of the different organizations that I've worked for in my over 30 years. The common thread that goes through all of these is I've been involved with local governments and I've been involved with the public budget. And those are the two things that I love. And so I love continuing to be associated with the Utah League of Cities and Towns and work with all of you as you work on your budgets. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about the budget. I am going to talk a lot about transparency in budgeting. It is something I feel very strongly about and something I think is very important. As you all know, citizens are becoming increasingly cynical about their government, and I think that you at the local government level stand in the perfect spot to help erase some of that cynicism, and you'll do it through transparency. We'll talk about some budgeting basics. We'll talk about fund budgeting. We're going to talk a little bit about revenue and expenses. I have a term that I call budget creep. We'll touch on that. And then we're really going to talk about monitoring some revenue as well. I'm probably not leaving a lot of time for questions. So what is the public budget? The public budget is more than just an accounting of revenue and expenses. And I hope that as I speak to you today, you can kind of feel my passion for public budgeting. It's because the budget is the way that you get to show your community what your priorities are. Don't tell me what you prioritize. Let me look at your budget and I'll tell you what you prioritize. I'll tell you what's important to you. If you tell me that parks are important to you and I look at your budget and there's very little budgeted for parks, quite frankly, I don't believe you. This is how you get your policy priorities done. And so if all you want to do is take last year's numbers, tweak them a little bit, adopt them and move forward, I think you're missing the most important and the most fun part of budgeting, which is start to talk about how do we shift some of the revenues. I was elected, and I'm being you right now. I would never put my name on a ballot, but you were brave enough to do that. And when you look and say, I was elected, and I was elected because Councilmember Fowler in Salt Lake City, people wanted what you told them you were going to do. You said you were going to do some things. The only way you can do it is by shifting the budget to accomplish those policy goals. It is not scary or boring. Mayor Overton, you and I have talked a lot of times about do not vote for it until you understand it. And I know that statement makes your staff crazy. They want to come and say, Kerri, why do you tell them that? And I said, I don't want them to vote on it until they understand it. It's too important to just vote on it and not know what you're voting on. Taxpayers trust you with their hard-earned money. You are now the one that you take in that money. They've worked hard for it. They hand it over in taxes, and now they trust you. They deserve to know what you've accomplished with it. Some of the ways you can talk to them about what you've accomplished with it, one is clearly the budget document. And especially in our smaller communities throughout the state of Utah, a lot of times you'll just publish a list of numbers. Boring. Give me the narrative. Talk to me about what those numbers mean, because you know what they mean, because I just told you not to vote on it if you don't, so you know what it means. Put the narrative in so that you can demonstrate to them and you can explain to the public what it means. Also, hold budget hearings. Talk to the public. And don't just hold the budget hearings that you're required to hold by law. I want to give you a story about a community. Just before the recession, there is a community in the state of Utah that decided that they were going to go through the process that Roger described, truth in taxation, and they were going to raise property taxes. They felt like they needed to do that. Instead of holding one public hearing, they actually scheduled a series of town meetings over about a 2 or 3 month period of time. They produced materials so that they could go out and they could talk to the citizens in their community about the challenges they were facing within that budget. And they held these meetings, and citizens came in and they saw the challenges, and they interfaced with elected officials, and it wasn't a person standing up like this talking to them, but it was more in a town hall style where citizens could really interact with the elected officials and talk about what those challenges were. They did that probably 5 or 6 times in locations throughout the entire city. And when it came time to actually vote on the budget, and they put their newspaper ads in that talked about the amount of increase they were having, and they voted on that budget increase, people didn't come at them with pitchforks for increasing taxes. I don't think they had actually much input at that final hearing because they had had so much all the way along, and they had communicated with citizens that they were soliciting this kind of input. And then the 2008 recession happened. And that city weathered the recession better than most. Now, I don't want to say they were rewarded for what they did, but in some weird way I think they were. They've been a very strong city, but they took the idea of transparency and transparency in budgeting to a level, I had been talking about it for years, and they were just the most wonderful example of the magic that can really happen when you engage your citizenry at that level in talking about your budget, and not just doing it at one time of year when you set the budget, but actually making the budget a living, breathing part of your community and what you do. So that's kind of me on my soapbox, but I hope that a few of you would consider that process, that you don't just hold just the one requisite public hearing, but you actually solicit input from the citizens that's meaningful. Transparency is not a fad. We've been talking about transparency in budgeting for a very long time. I don't believe it will go away. And I think Cam and Roger have probably talked to you a little bit about the way that the legislature likes to pass legislation. So a lot of the times they don't pass legislation that impacts them necessarily, but they pass legislation that impacts you. And so then they can talk about transparency because they passed a transparency law that impacts you. What I would suggest is be out there on the leading edge. And when I work with communities throughout the state of Utah, I always say, let's make it so that when Cam has to have that legislative conversation, he can hold up examples of communities that have been going above and beyond so that he can argue, we don't need that bill. Our cities and towns are already doing this. They're already holding more hearings than they need to. They're already engaging the public in the conversation in a more holistic way than what they're required to by the bare minimum of the law. Here are a couple of the budgeting basics that you need to know. Fiscal year for municipalities, it's different than a calendar year. It's July 1 to June 30th for every local government in the state of Utah. If you are doing contracts with counties, that's going to get a little difficult for you because they're on a different fiscal year. They're on a January 1 to December 31. If you're doing those same kind of intergovernmental contracts with districts, the same thing. I see some of our township friends here. They probably know better, Greg Schultz, you know better than anybody how to marry those 2 fiscal years together because you've been doing it for your entire career. But it's challenging. It's a challenge when you talk about how you're going to do that. Budget reports. There ought to be budget reports produced, monthly budget reports for management. And so some of you, and when I talk about management, those of you from larger communities need to understand that the people sitting next to you from a small community, they actually manage a portfolio, even as a council member within their community. So do I have people here who might be over streets or parks? No? Yep, I've got a few. Okay, so you need to be looking at those budgets as a manager. not just as a legislative official. And you're looking for some different things, and we can talk online about some unique ways that you manage that when you're looking at it just from that managerial standpoint. But for the legislative body, you ought to be taking a peek at it at least quarterly. And if your staff in your community is not used to giving you quarterly budget reports, now's a really great time in a new year to ask them to do that. And to tell them that you want it within a couple of weeks of the quarter's end so that you actually have time to react to it. You have to file your budget with the state auditor 30 days after it's adopted. And if you don't have somebody in your city who's doing that, you need to make sure that you do. The state auditor, I would say, Cam, is it fair to say that is becoming increasingly interested in having those reports filed timely? Aggressively interested. Cam's term, not mine. There are consequences. And then there's also a financial report that gets filed on all of your communities that gets filed together. And it includes your financial statement report, your compliance audit. But the really great thing about all of us having to file these is you used to call me, or the people who went before you used to call me when I was at the League of Cities and Towns and say, hey, I'm really interested in what other types of communities are doing. How much do they bring in this revenue source? Or how much do they spend on this type of activity? And at the League of Cities and Towns, gosh, 20 years ago, we created a database where we were tracking that kind of information while the state was still just having you report it in a paper format. And so I would be able to look up and I would be able to tell the people in Vineyard what the people in Highland were doing and what the revenue looked like. You now have access to that at your fingertips. If you have internet access, you can get on the internet and go to these reports that the state auditor has you file, and you can see what's going on in other communities. You can also see what's going on at the League of Cities and Towns, because Nick is working on getting those filed as well. But it's a wealth of information that helps you in your decision making within your own community. Here are some of the things that you need to know about local government budgets. Have to be balanced. We do not have the flexibility of deficit spending in the state of Utah or at the local government level. So your revenue needs to balance with your expenditures. Now, if you're projecting that you're going to have a pretty good year on revenue, you can allocate money to fund balance, and we'll talk about fund balance in just a second, but by allocating money to fund balance, that's how you balance your budget. You cannot plan to spend more money than you have available, okay? You just can't do it. All funds in government, and we're going to talk through what funds are in just a minute, but every single fund, the fund balance lapses on June 30th. And it lapses except for the capital improvement fund. And we'll talk about why that one's different. But when they lapse to the balance of their own fund. Okay, so kind of think of it about like different checking accounts that you might have if you have two different funds. The money to move from one checking account to another, you have to do something to do that. Otherwise, the money stays within its account. And that's how it is with funds. So at the end of the year when those fund balances lapse, there is a state law that says how much you can have in there. And it's a snapshot that gets taken June 30th when the books close. And if you're a city, you can have 25% of your budgeted revenue in your fund balance when you close your year. And you can see towns and districts have some different limits. So let's talk about the different funds. When I'm talking to you about funds, you have a general fund. Does everybody here know what their general fund is? Do you know what the general fund of your government is? Okay, let me describe it for a minute then. The general fund is where you will provide most of the services that are kind of broad in nature to your community. So the kinds of revenues that go into the general fund is property tax, sales tax, business license fees. You might have some other licensing fees. Just kind of those broad-based charges go into your general fund. And usually you pay out of your general fund for things like police, fire, planning and zoning, parks, just kind of really the basic general welfare of the community type things. Then there are things in local government called enterprise funds. And those of you who run businesses will love enterprise funds because they look and feel a little bit more like a business to you. So give me an example of a service that local government might provide that would run a little more like a business and maybe be an enterprise fund. Water, that's a great example. Any others? Garbage, another. Sewer. Anything else? Probably not roads. Probably wouldn't run roads as an enterprise fund, and we'll talk about it in just a minute why. Golf courses. Now, Councilmember Fowler, you guys are having a little discussion in your community about whether or not you're going to continue to run a golf program as an enterprise fund. And let's talk about the policy decision about why you wouldn't run roads and why someone might choose to run a golf course as an enterprise fund and others may choose to go a different route. So the big difference is that the general fund is providing the services from general taxpayers. And an enterprise fund, what you say is the set of users, the people who use the service are different than the general tax-paying public. So let's use water as the first example. Could there be water users who are not taxpayers? Okay, give me an example. Church, hospital. Nonprofits, right? They use water, but they don't pay taxes. And so we're able to say, well, you need to pay for the use of water, and so we're going to run it as an enterprise fund, and even though you don't pay taxes, you do have to pay for the water that you use. So roads, the way that you get the funding on roads, it's kind of hard other than your BNC road fund formula to say, how am I going to assess the users of the road? So instead, we kind of leave that in our general fund and pay for it as a general fund operation. But then when we talk about golf courses, there's a policy discussion, and that's the real fun of what the legislative body does. You get to have policy discussions. And you get to say, should the people who play golf pay for all of golf and the amenities of golf, or does the general tax-paying public derive a benefit from having open spaces and green spaces in the community, and maybe we shouldn't solely burden those who go. I think golf's called golf because all the other four-letter words were taken. So those like me who like to go hit the little white ball, maybe we shouldn't solely burden those people with paying for these open spaces. So that's the policy debate. And Salt Lake City may come up with a different answer from their elected leadership than what Cottonwood Heights, although you don't have a golf course, but than what you might come up with if you had that same policy debate within your community. Murray, you guys run yours as an enterprise fund, right? Your golf course? For now, yes. He says. Okay. Talk to Amy. The Capital Projects Fund. I told you that the Capital Projects Fund is the one fund that all of the money doesn't roll to the fund balance at the end of the year. And it's one of my favorite funds because it's really where you get to plan ahead, where you get to plan for the future. So it takes legislative action to create a capital project. So if you decide we want to build a swimming pool, and you put money in the Capital Projects Fund so that you can build that swimming pool, the money stays with that project until the project's done. So that every year it doesn't fall to the fund balance and you don't have to have the conversation in the council about rebudgeting the money to build the swimming pool. So the money just stays there and bounces along with the swimming pool until the swimming pool's done. Except, guess what? The way the Capital Projects Fund works is somebody has to tell it that the swimming pool's done. So when I was just a youngster starting out my career, I was working for a city council who came to me and said that they wanted some additional money to do some things within their budget. And, Roger's talked to you and Cam's talked to you about how difficult it is to get a new revenue source. It's kind of hard. So you have to kind of look within and you have to see if you can repurpose things. But one of the things that occurred to the budget team as we were looking at it was that there were a bunch of capital projects sitting in the Capital Project Fund that were done. They were completed. We knew kids were swimming in the pool. But the project was still open. And when we looked at it, there was some money. And so I will tell you, one of the highlights of my career was walking into that legislative body and saying, we just found you $2 million in closed capital projects that hurts no one. We can take that money and we can repurpose it if you want to right back into the capital projects fund into new projects, or you can use it on other things. Now tell me the downside of using that money. Is it ongoing? No, it's one time. So can I buy a police officer with that money? No. I have to look for things in the budget that can be supported as one-time expenditures with that money. But those, see why I love budgeting? See how much fun it is? So I want you to learn that you can look for all of these different things within your budget. Debt service fund, that's if you've got bonds, a lot of times communities will use the debt service fund for that. Internal service funds are usually used by our larger communities. That is where you will segregate the services where you provide services back to your own government. So maybe if you're a big enough government that you have an entire fleet operations, you'd run that as an internal service fund and you would charge your different agencies their piece of the fleet operation. So a lot of you are small enough that you won't use that. Salt Lake, you use it. Murray, I don't know if you do, if you run internal service funds, but a lot of times the larger communities run those. And then special revenue funds. These are exactly as they sound. So if you bring in E911 money, a lot of times the community has decided to run that through a special revenue fund because there are very clear reasons or very clear things you can spend that money on, and you want to segregate it away from the other money to demonstrate that you're not misappropriating it, that you're spending it on the purpose for which it was collected. So in your budget process, I'm jumping now. We're moving to the next part. When you sit down to look at your budget, again, make sure that the services that you're funding are aligning with your organizational goals. Because if you're funding a service that you say, I don't really know why we're funding this, you know, it might be time for a policy discussion about whether or not you repurpose those funds into something to meet the needs of today. And I would say that, raise your hand if you're brand new to public office, brand new this year. That is a lot of change in a lot of communities, and so it is time to have those kinds of conversations. A lot of times you'll have councils who have been together for a while, and so they maybe don't need to go through the conversation each time about, oh, you know, are we really lined up with our priorities? But to pick on Salt Lake City again, I read in the newspaper your most tenured council member is 6 years. 6 years. That is a new council. And so to continue to do things the way they've been doing it for a decade or 15 years probably doesn't make a lot of sense with the mandate of change that's been voted in that city over time. You want to review your service delivery options. And this doesn't mean you privatize everything, but it means that you at least ask the question once in a while and you say, could we deliver this service better, maybe by not providing it in-house? Or sometimes you'll do the reverse. I was working with a community that had a sidewalk repair program, and they had two aspects to that sidewalk repair program. One aspect was a contracted program and one aspect was an in-house. And they were looking and they were seeing that the contracted or the in-house program was costing more than the contracted program, and they couldn't figure out why. And when they finally looked at it, it's because they were requiring the in-house program to pour the sidewalk an inch deeper than they were requiring the contractor to pour it. And so it's things like that you want to take a look at every once in a while, and you need to know your budget so that you can take a look at it and ask yourself the questions. If it logically doesn't make sense, it probably doesn't make sense. And so be sure to ask those questions. Please review your fees. How many of you have a policy of structured fee review in your community? Excellent, excellent, gold star communities. What happens if you don't review your fees on any kind of a routine schedule is the fees lose pace with covering the cost of service. And so all of a sudden, you're subsidizing the service with other general fund revenue sources when you had decided that it was a fee-based service. And so my suggestion is, if you are not going to collect a fee that fully recovers the cost of service, make sure you made that policy decision. Make sure it didn't just happen by happenstance. I used to work, yes, question.
Very often cities will just look at the cities around them to see what they charge rather than actually evaluate what their true costs are.
Sure.
Can you talk to that?
Yeah, I wouldn't do my fees that way. If I had made the policy decision that a service was a fee-based service, I would then go through the intellectual work, and you can either get a consultant that doesn't cost you $1 million, or you can have someone on staff cost the process for you. So that then you look around to the other communities and say, will the market tolerate me recovering the full cost of service? So it causes two questions to be asked. Number one, has community X over here costed their service? And if so, why is the cost of their service less than mine? That's a great question I would love to dive into. And if we determine that the two services are equal and they're just not recovering full cost, well, maybe we don't want to make that policy decision. We want to recover full cost. And the whole issue is, if you're choosing not to recover full cost, make sure you're choosing not to. There may be a very good policy reason why you would say, we're not going to recover the full cost, we're only going to recover part and allow the rest to be subsidized. But as the legislative body, make sure you made that decision. Make sure it didn't just happen to you. Okay? Let's bounce on. Let's talk about revenue for just a minute. Projecting revenue, I like to say, is part art, part science, part philosophy, and part luck. And the whole goal in this is that some of your revenue projections exceed the projection by a similar amount that some might lag behind, so that at the end of the day, you're kind of here on your revenue projections. And as you get to know your budget, you will get very good at sort of understanding when you watch the revenue and you say, ooh, revenue's down, I've got to figure out what's going on. Why is it down? Roger talked to you about not a lot of malls being built. I mean, the sales tax revenue is not growing the way it used to grow 15 years ago. But you need to get to understand your community's revenue pace. And there are things that impact revenue. These are some of them. I don't need to go through it. Keep an eye also on expenses. They're hard to control, especially if you don't find problems early. So I'm not going to go through one of the slides that I have, but let me tell you, if you have a service that is largely personnel services, and a lot of our budgets are, because we're in the service business and it takes people to provide the services, and if you are running ahead of budget and you don't find that in Q1, you are in trouble by Q3. So keep an eye on that, especially your services that are employee heavy. I'm not going to go through this slide. I'm going to bing through it because we're running low on time, as I do. These are some areas where you can watch for natural underexpend in your budget. Staff overturn. In government, when staff leaves, there's usually a lag before we bring the next person in. That will be a one-time savings that you could maybe turn into a priority if you've got your priority list. Reward people who work for you for finding ways to save money, and don't make the reward be that we just cut your budget. Okay, share some of the savings with them. They're not likely to find those savings if the response is, oh wow, now we got less to do more. And then I would encourage you, and this is a whole nother conversation, begin to focus on outcomes rather than just outputs. Instead of just saying, this is how many we produced and this is what it cost us to produce it and this is the time that we did it in, start talking about why and what the big impacts are and why you're really doing it. It's so what, and keep that conversation going on. There's some budget creep that happens. I want you to watch out for it. Those who have larger staffs, mid-year reclassifications. Have a policy about how you do reclassifications in your community for your staff. If you reclassify a position mid-year, that's ongoing money that's gone from the budget, and the legislative body has no authority over that anymore when it comes to budget time. Hiring above the entry level, have a policy. Make sure that you know what the tolerance is to hire above an entry level and who has the authority to go at different levels. I'm not gonna read the rest of them to you because you can see them. If you don't understand it, ask questions until you do. Please remember to watch revenue. I want to maybe end with this story. I was working with a government, and it was a golf enterprise fund, so it was one of the governments that decided to have a golf fund. And we were working with the golf program manager, and we could not get this manager to understand that he was over budget, because he had not spent all of the money that had been appropriated for expenditure. So he kept saying, I'm not over budget. I'm not over budget. My expenditure number, let's make it easy, is $1 million. I've only spent $750,000. I'm not over budget. We said, yeah, but you've only brought in $600,000. You're over budget. You've got to watch both. I don't care if you have $1 million expenditure budget. If your revenue only came in at $600,000, you no longer have $1 million expenditure budget. And so you need to watch both sides. I tend to see legislative bodies really want to watch expenditures because they think that that's being very fiscally responsible. But remember to watch revenue. It's equally fiscally responsible to watch that revenue. So I want to give you a teaser for April. In April, I have developed a set of slides that really talks you through how we establish property taxes in the state of Utah. I think you've seen them, huh? When we show all the houses and we show what happens and we talk about when you need to go through truth and taxation. And I tried to jam that at one point into my Budgeting 101 presentation, and it didn't work. It just took too long. So I want you to come in April to the League's conference in St. George. The dates, Cam? April 25th to the 27th. Cam will probably again put me between you and lunch, or their other favorite spot for me is the last session on the agenda, which is lovely to try to keep everybody entertained when I'm very last. But please come to that, because the feedback I've been getting on the property tax, the way we go through it, has been great, and I want to test it out on you guys, and I want to see if it helps you understand how we do property taxes in Utah. So thank you for allowing me to spend some time, and go get your lunch.